serious. They now knew otherwise. Local and federal law enforcement took notice as well. Those weren't the kind of headlines police chiefs and federal agents liked to read. The killings got big play in the news. The public and every 1%er in the country were aware of them. Those in the know expected Mongol retaliation, but the Hells Angels were just getting started. 2 days later, the bodies of Redbeard and Jingles were on view at the Lemon Grove mortuary. A Dago member whose identity remains a point of debate to this day drove up in a white Rambler and parked next to the building. He walked in and dropped a bouquet of red and white carnations on Jingles' casket. The Hells Angels' colors would have been obvious to anyone in the room. I'm guessing that the Mongols in the room either thought it was a peace gesture or were too stunned at the loss of power to react. The guy said to walk away untouched and unidentified. A couple minutes later, he remotely detonated a bomb concealed in the Rambler. He had parked the car in the wrong place, or the damage would have been much worse. Still, the explosion injured 3 people. Bombs were a favorite weapon among outlaw bikers. It was easy to get your hands on explosives. It didn't take a genius to wire a crude bomb. They did big damage, and they created real fear. Outlaw clubs also had plenty of military veterans among their members, guys with lots of experience wiring explosives. But I hated bombs. They were messy and cruel. People got maimed as often as they got killed. More than that, I hated the idea of civilian casualties. It seemed stupid to bring that much attention to the club and potentially hurt people who had nothing to do with the beef. Not to mention you could blow yourself up with a single mistake. Explosives were just way too unpredictable for my tastes. My opinion wasn't popular. The bomb at the Mongols' memorial had sent a message that everybody wanted sent. We're not done with you yet. To most of the club, another bomb seemed like a really good idea. I walked into the clubhouse a couple days after the memorial bombing to find Ray meeting with a few other members and some of the guys from Dago. It took me about 30 seconds to realize that they were talking about blowing more Mongols up. You guys ever hear of collateral damage? You keep setting up these bombs, this shit's going to go wrong in a big way. I saw the looks I got. The easiest thing in the club was to make accusations. Oh, this guy doesn't want a bomb to go off in downtown Los Angeles? He must be an informant, or a cop, or he's just fucking weak. I knew that they were thinking all that, and calling me a coward behind my back. But it was getting out of hand. I left before I heard any more. Days later, word went around the clubhouse. They had put a bomb down a roof vent in a Highland Park motorcycle shop called The Frame Up. The shop was owned by 2 Mongols. Something went wrong with the detonator or the bomb. The bomb didn't go off. John took me aside and told me that I had to retrieve it. Are you kidding? Why not just leave it there? George, you have to do this. People need to know that you're going to take care of business no matter what you think about it. The club has to come first. This guy's saying things right now, and you've got to prove them wrong. I already know what you're about. Now you got to convince them. Belonging to the Hells Angels means doing dangerous things. Your participation becomes your credentials. Waver in any way, and you become suspect. A lot of times in the outlaw culture, saying no just isn't an option. This was one of them. Okay, John, I'll get it done. Take Jesse, get that thing out of the roof vent, and take it over to the garage. That's all you got to do. One of the other guys will take it apart. That's all I had to do. I knew that in his own way, John was looking out for me. He wanted to show everyone that I was the stand-up guy he saw, that I would get the job done no matter what. Yet Ray was clearly not the real deal. It was important to make sure everyone understood who could hold their mud and who couldn't. So at 10 that night, Jesse and I headed over to the Frame Up. The shop was in a neighborhood of auto body repair places, metalworking shops, and junkyards. We backed down the alleyway inside the building and checked the guard dogs were keeping around. A pull-down roof ladder was attached to the back wall, and Jesse posted me up so I could grab it and climb on the roof. I found the vent easily enough, and a rope holding the bomb had been tied out to the rooftop vent pipe. I untied it and slowly began pulling the bomb up. It was impossible to do without the bombs swinging side to side. It was like a game of operation, and every time the bomb clanged into the sheet metal vent wall, I thought it would go off. I got it out and carried it carefully to the roof edge, right above where Jesse was standing. I started to lower it by playing out the rope. When it was inches within his reach, the bomb started swinging, bumping into the wall. Jesus, George. I know. We were both freaked out, but I finally got the bomb down into Jesse's hands. I climbed down and we carried the bomb to the car. Where do you want to put it? It was a good question. I looked at Jesse and shook my head. I hadn't thought beyond just getting it down off the roof. We still had to take it for a 30-minute drive. Shit, I don't know. The trunk? The trunk's right over the gas tank, man. It goes and we're going to blow like the 4th of July. So where? The back seat? I think it's the best place. We found a blanket and nestled the bomb on it, as if that would somehow stop the thing from blowing up. We both straightened up and looked at this bundle of dynamite sticks held together with duct tape. It looked cartoonish, like a bad movie plot. We burst out laughing. The absurdity of the situation, along with sheer tension, had built up to the point that laughing was the only way to deal with it. It was hysterical, crazy laughter. We were bent over, tears running down our faces. We calmed down long enough to get settled in the car. I fired it up and moved out and down the street. A block later, we went over a set of railroad tracks that was a much bigger double bump than we expected. It really rattled the car. We looked over at each other and burst out laughing again. It took us the rest of the trip to stop. We drove the bomb back to the garage and then dropped the car off at the clubhouse where I picked up my bike. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I took a moment just to breathe. The ride home and put things back in order in perspective. Give the club credit for persistence. Just 3 weeks after the bombing of the Mongols Memorial, Los Angeles prospect Thomas Heath walked a flat motorcycle tire into the frame up, ready and rig the bomb inside the tire so that it would detonate with a tight valve was unscrewed. After an hour, Heath called the shop and asked if the tire was done. He talked to Mongol Henry Jimenez. They had a heated exchange. Heath pressing for the tire to be fixed so he could get on his bike before nightfall. Jimenez finally told him he would get it done. Jimenez wasn't alone. Raymond Hernandez, the 15-year-old brother of another Mongol, was hanging out in the shop. You can imagine, the 15-year-old kid hasn't even started shaving yet. He was hanging out with this guy he must have looked up to. He was changing oil and helping out as best he could. Learning, thinking about how soon he would have his own bike. This kid knew exactly what type of Harley he was going to have. Maybe a beat-up bomber he could trick out right there. Like every other 15-year-old boy with a biker brother and a father, he knew exactly how his own bike was going to look and how cool he was going to look riding it. But he never got a chance to build or ride a motorcycle. He would never even own a driver's license. Henry Jimenez held the tire steady and began unscrewing the valve. The bomb contacts came together, and Mongol and teenager were instantly killed in a blast that blew the windows out of the buildings on either side of the shop. Heath called again an hour later. Someone else answered. The sounds of sirens and chaos filled the background. "Yeah, your tire's ready, motherfucker. Come down and get it." Heath hung up and laughed. It was a joke to him. For days, he went on about the explosion. "You should have heard that fucking guy. I bet his ears were ringing." He was almost doubled over with laughter as he said it. John finally had to tell him to shut up about it. Justice would be served decades later when Heath was sentenced to 35 to life for a domestic dispute beef that brought him a third strike conviction. But to most of the club, it didn't matter. War was war, and collateral damage was to be expected. Days later, the president of the San Fernando Valley Mongol Charter, Luis Gutierrez, went out to his driveway to get in his van. It blew up as he opened the door. He was luckier than the 15-year-old. He escaped with his life and his body intact. The violence drew even more attention. Law enforcement doesn't care when bikers kill bikers, but they don't like innocent kids getting blown up. From that point on, you couldn't wear your colors on paved roads in Southern California without getting jacked up. Those of us who loved it were having a lot of fun, and I couldn't get that feeling out of my head. A few nights later, I got home before the kids were in bed. I had been gone for 2 days, and the kids were overjoyed to see me. They had a little ritual. My place in the living room was a big old black easy chair with gigantic mountain sit one kid on each side and let my arms around them. Mariah had just taken a bath, and she pressed it on me, reading the picture of herself. Her hair smelled sweetly of kid sugar. I held George and Alice on the other side as he played between the car. The TV was on, but I wasn't paying attention. I was just writing. The moment was century. Cheryl was a good time. Nobody was asking me to juggle money on her sheets somewhere. There were no psychotic relatives here. I had always held a dad of all this hero. But that was being test. Sooner or later, Dad was as himself what he's got guilty. No one works with anything else in his life. It all started with the idea of having a simple good time. Partying with brothers, hanging out, building, riding bikes, and living our own version of the American dream. But love seemed to have gotten a long way from that for I sat in my little 4-foot by 4-foot square container and wondered how I missed getting shipped out of Vietnam, only to wind up at home in the middle of the war. I thought about a 15-year-old boy who had probably never enjoyed a stiff drink, a drag race, or sex, and never won. Eventually, I had to ask myself, how long will I last? I told myself to cherish the moment. The moment that I could be in prison. I could be dead. Cheryl would let me in or kick me out. I squeezed the kids closer. Georgie squirmed in my grasp. There is no halfway in the outlaw world, especially the big piece of territory owned by Los Angeles. I always knew that. But questions are natural. They crept in. They didn't mean you were committed. I was committed. God knows I would have to be the head of things waiting right around the corner. 6. In the middle of a war with a Waco charter in serious trouble, Ray Moore was thinking first and foremost about business. Not charter business, and not Los Angeles business. Drug business. Cliff Mountain, prospect of Fox River, residents of the and on the scene for months. He had a reputation as a no-nonsense lifestyle. He was big, almost 6'4", but unlike a lot of bikers, he didn't carry a punch. He was a lean, muscular, hard-hitting fighter. I once saw him drop a hangover with one punch, the hardest I've ever seen for him or taken. The other guy was out for maybe 10 minutes, to the point that people started to get worried that he wasn't ever going to get out. So nobody had a problem when Ray sponsored Cliff to Prospect. What did seem odd was Cliff's girlfriend. They were attached to him. Everywhere he showed up, she would be with him. Prospects don't do that. Even married prospects ride alone and usually have something to their side. She was also out of his league and out of place in a clubhouse or bar. Too sophisticated, too well put together. I didn't think much of it at the time. A lot of different types of women are attracted to the bad boy biker image, and Cliff Maury was good looking. Life goes on, even in a war. California is such a big state that the charters in the north and the south often operated in different worlds. So even though the Mongols were a club life concern, Dago was driving the war. In November, Sonny Barger walked out of Folsom Freeman, 6 years short of his full sentence. Key players in Oakland and Frisco were busy protecting their interests in the meth business. Solano County Sheriff's Inspector Bill Sharkey was blown up getting into his car on the way to the courthouse for a hearing in the meth possession trial of Oakland Hells Angel Vice President James Brenda. Meanwhile, in Southern California, it was common knowledge that Cliff was moving drugs for Ray. Ray had Ventura County locked up and was looking to branch out into the much bigger drug market in Orange County. I think Ray planned on Cliff being his guy in the OC. The post-holiday lull quieted everything down. But in February, cops collared Robert Mexican Mike Johnson and William Filthy Bill Peters, staking out DA investigator Ray Morgan's house. Ray Morgan had arrested and testified against a lot of agents, and Johnson and Peters were Dago prospects. Cops searched their homes and found what they called a hit kit. It included a map to Morgan's house, camel gear, guns, and a parabolic mic. This just proved what every Hells Angel already knew. The Dago guys would take it to anybody. The hammer fell in April 1978 when squads of cops led by the Orange County Sheriff's Department made truck arrests throughout Southern California. The arrests were the conclusion of an undercover operation using evidence gathered by Cliff Mowry and his girlfriend, who in reality was not only his girlfriend, but also an Orange County Sheriff's investigator. The cops arrested Bruno when Ray Gore was the biggest fish cuffed. Russell Bayard rode down from Oakland, picked up Kim, and took her back to Oakland with him. Several years later, Russell would be shot several times for messing around with someone else's woman. Old habits die hard. It only took Ray a day or so to make bail, which was surprising given the list of charges and the huge quantity of meth he had sold to the sheriff's department. Ray called Jesse and told him to get over to the garage and clear out the explosives and guns before any more search warrants got served. Even though the garage had been rented for a slide, and there shouldn't have been a record connecting it to the club, it was a smart move. John drove Jesse over to the garage. John waited in the car while Jesse went to check out just how much stuff would need to be moved. The minute he slipped the key in the padlock, cops swarmed him. They had been waiting, had already been inside, and knew everything that was in the garage. Jesse was busted, along with John. But John was kicked loose immediately because he was nowhere near the garage when the cops grabbed Jesse. Jesse, though, was looking at serious time. Connecting the dots, it was a reasonable conclusion that Ray had ratted him out. The theory spread quickly. It made sense to those who knew Ray. He made bail too easily, and as sleazy as he was, nobody had trouble believing that he would flip to save his own ass. I never saw or heard any evidence that Ray had rolled on Jesse, but in hard times it's easy to believe the worst. Ray rattled around in an empty house because Kim was now Russell's property. Ray didn't get much time to get used to the solitude. I have no idea who he thought was at the door when he heard the knocking, but it had to be someone he knew to have made it past the guard dogs that Ray kept chained up around his property. He must have been some kind of surprised when he opened the door to find death had come to collect. A hail of bullets greeted him, down before he hit the floor. Even on a slab, though, he gave the club one more black eye. The cops used the excuse of investigating his murder to toss his house. They uncovered detailed records of every single Hells Angel on the coast, and everyone Ray knew overseas. The cops might have worked decades to piece together this kind of information on their own. But thanks to Ray's stupidity, Christmas came early for the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Ray's murder had a long tail. There were plenty of suspects. Rumors and detectives pinned the hit variously on Jesse, Russell, Tom Heath, or me. Jesse was the prime suspect in the minds of many inside and outside the club. But unlike actors in a movie, real murderers rarely discuss their crimes. I never found out who killed Ray, and truth is, I didn't care. Whoever it was, two things were for certain. It wasn't me, and the killer did the world a favor. The problem was law enforcement likes to close cases, especially high-profile murder investigations that smell like professional hits. That means the heat was on in Southern California in 1978, long before summer came around. Some LACO members showed signs of folding under the pressure. Guys were missing meetings, gladly paying fines so they didn't have to have their license numbers jotted down by undercover narcs staking out the clubhouse. Or they'd drive their cars to the clubhouse, park a few blocks away, and walk the rest of the way. I'd be somewhere and see a member riding without his patch. It was against the rules. You're not just a Hell's Angel when the patch is getting you women and free drinks at a bar. Tough times are when angels step up and show they can hold their mud. Something had to be done. The frustration came to a head for me when we were asked to vote on a member transfer. Michael, Irish O'Farrell, was as tough as nails outlaw, ruggedly handsome with long, thick brown hair and sad, soulful eyes that made him a favorite with women. He was fast with his fists and a legendary fighter, which made him a favorite among members. At a time of chaos for LACO, he was the last person we could afford to lose, especially since he wanted to transfer to Oakland. He was also in prison, and the club had a rule that members couldn't transfer while they were behind bars. I was the only one to vote against the transfer, but it only takes one. Transfers have to be unanimous. The next day, I got a call from Russell Bayard. He wanted me to come up to Oakland discuss Irish's situation. The tension between the two charters had eased as soon as Ray was murdered, and I didn't feel like I was taking a chance venturing into the heart of Oakland. So I jumped on my bike and rode up to Russell's house. We had barely said hello and settled into his living room with a couple cups of coffee when he got down to it. Why are you holding up Irish? Because he needs to come down and talk to us like anybody else would. He needs to give us his reasons. You know he's locked up. He can't be there to explain it. That's why you can't transfer when you're inside. You know that, Russell. Those are your rules, same as mine. He needs to talk to us about it. He needs to explain why one of the strongest members in L.A. wants to go to Oakland. You guys are complaining about us, but here you are drawing from us, taking all our good people. That doesn't make any sense. Russell was quiet for a minute. Then he nodded, and the slightest hint of a smile played across his face. Russell wasn't stupid, and neither was I. I was right, and he knew it. Okay, George, I hear you. We'll play it by the rules then. The Hells Angels is stacked with alpha males. Russell was at the head of the pack. Not many people inside the club or out had the balls to tell him no. But I was an alpha male too, even if I was always the most social Hells Angel in the room. I wasn't going to back down when I knew I was right. It's what made me an asset. The Angels operate between the poles of fear and respect. You give and get one or the other. I respected Russell, and he knew it. But he also respected me, more so exactly because I didn't fear him. Even as it frustrated his attempt at shortcutting club rules, he respected that I wouldn't let him and the rest of Oakland run roughshod over my charter. As a sign that there were no hard feelings, and that I hadn't ridden 5 hours for a 10-minute conversation, Russell told me he had someone he wanted me to meet. I knew who that someone was. Russell Bale lived in an upscale suburban East Oakland neighborhood that skirted a golf course on a street called Gulf Links Road. Another Hells Angel lived on that road down at the end. His name was Sonny Barger. Russell led the way as we rode down to Sonny's house. It was a sizable piece of property with a small white wood-framed house on it. It had a manicured lawn and well-tended flowering bushes clustered around the foundation. The only thing that set the house apart from the others on the road, the only clue that this wasn't another suburban commuter's tract house, was the tall chain-link security fence around the perimeter. Sonny met us at the door, keeping his dogs behind him. I played it cool, but there was no getting around the fact that I was starstruck. I'm thinking, I'm at Sonny Barger's house. I'm meeting Oakland Sonny Barger. Ralph Sonny Barger had founded and built the Oakland Charter when he was in his early 20s, and the Hells Angels at large were just Purdue and Frisco. He had turned his corner of the outlaw world into a base of power almost entirely on the force of his will. Sonny had undeniable charisma. When he wanted to, he could win anybody over. He was an icon, not only of the Hells Angels, but of the entire outlaw motorcycle world. He was also a natural-born leader. Even strong, independent men gravitated to him and listened when he spoke. He invited us in, and we shook hands. Sonny was smaller than I expected, but built solidly from having lifted a lot of weights in Folsom Prison. He smiled and offered us a drink. You guys are having a rough time down south. It's a little hot. We all laughed. But I hear good things about you from the slaves. I found out later that Slave Louie, one of my best friends in the slaves, had talked me up to Fu Griffin, who passed it on to Sonny. Louie had done time with Fu in Folsom, and all the Oakland members respected him. It was a powerful endorsement. That meeting was a highlight of my time as a Hells Angel. I understood all that Sonny had accomplished, and I felt that I could learn something from him. Sonny, though, had other things on his mind. Sonny was locked in a power struggle with Sergei Walton, who had risen to become the Oakland president. Sergei was a reputed meth cook and drug supplier, and was a stone gangster. A lot of people in the Bay Area relied on him for lucrative cash flow. Sonny was battling to reestablish his power in Oakland, and by extension the entire club. He'd win, but it would take time. After a quick and cordial talk, we said our goodbyes. I headed over to Animal's place to catch up with him, then rode home in the morning. It was a long ride, but worthwhile. I knew I'd made my case. If you're going to be taken seriously in the outlaw world, you have to do the hard things. Stand up for what you believe in, even when the people you're standing up to are legends. Show fear to anyone in the Hells Angels, and you'll never be respected. So many members didn't understand that basic concept. Back home, we had a lot of business to take care of inside Laco. A Hells Angel charter needs a strong leader. Without one, it's chaos, and the charter will be seen as a liability by the club at large. The sheriff's operation and Cliff Mowry's infiltration had far-reaching consequences, causing the club problems up and down California. Laco was at the center of all that, and we needed to right the ship fast. That started with leadership. The easy choice was old man John. Everybody knew him. He didn't have an agenda, and despite the Mongol War, he was still respected. He had been beat down by everything that had happened, but he agreed when I asked him. Everyone will vote for you, John. It will be good for the charter. I'll do it if you come along as the vice president, George. I need to know there's someone I trust backing me. You're going to have to carry the water. The vote was quick and easy, and just like that, with a vice president patch sewn to the front of my gut, I was a Hells Angels officer. Jesse was out on bail fighting the weapons possession case. For safety reasons, the cops had removed the explosives from the garage before Jesse showed up. That reduced the charges considerably. It would play out over time, but ultimately, the case would come down to a single count of possession of an automatic weapon. No small beef, but manageable. I took Jesse aside and gave him a soft lecture. I told him he had to lie low and keep his temper in check. If he wrote it out, he'd get minimal time and probably probation. His record was clean, with no priors to complicate sentencing. The first order of business, as I saw it, with John's blessing, was to clean house. Half the charter had basically gone to ground. I understood they were scared, but that meant they had to go. You have to know what you're signing up for when you wear the patch. I didn't like cops following me night and day either, but I wasn't going to lock up every time someone knocked on the door. That kind of fear makes you a risk. A minor bust for outstanding tickets ends up with a detective's threat and a scared member talking into a tape recorder. So we made a list of who was in and who was out. Jesse and I got on our bikes and started knocking on doors and collecting patches. House to house, we told guys they were out and took all their Hells Angels indicia. Patches, rings, pins, posters, you name it. Some were ordered to black out any death head tattoos, or we'd cut them off. The look of relief on some of the faces confirmed that we'd made the right decision. John sent me up to my first West Coast officers meeting to announce the changes. Jesse rode up with me to the Oakland clubhouse. When the order of business came around to Laco, I stood up and said, "We've made changes. We trimmed a little fat." I read from my handwritten list. So-and-so is gone, this guy is gone, that guy is gone. The looks around the table could have been translated to, who the fuck is this guy? But a charter handles its own business. That's the way it is. I wasn't looking to make a statement. I just wanted to show that we were firmly in control. I didn't want to hear any more buzz about shutting down Laco or bitching about how we had fucked things up. It was also a way to establish myself as someone in the structure who wasn't afraid to take care of business. That day served many purposes. Most of the Oakland members appreciated how I handled things, even when they disagreed with me, which was often. From that point on, I always got a warm welcome in Oakland. Although the charter's roots were blue-collar, by the late 70s, Oakland had become stylish. A lot of money, legal and otherwise, was floating around in the Bay Area, and members weren't shy about spending it. A lot of guys wore boots made from exotic skins and drove brand-new Corvettes or Cadillacs with all the accessories. Their bikes were custom-painted and a world away from the thrown-together rides in the Hells Angels Life magazine spread from 1965. Oakland Hells Angels liked their jewelry. They rolled with gold, silver, and diamonds. Southern California style was different, more about trimming your facial hair a certain way, or wearing a trendy pair of shoes or really cool Ray-Bans. But Oakland knew style when they saw it. I liked to stand out and spend time making my bike look just as sweet as it ran. Jesse never fit in with the Oakland crew, and it bothered me. I always brought Jesse with me and knew that he had my back no matter what. He was a true, honorable one-percenter, but he was also a simple mechanic, a working man through and through. He wore shit-kicking, worn-out black work boots, and whatever shirt fell off the laundry pile that day. He was honest, loyal, and tough as they come. His bike always ran, but it looked like a workhorse. It would have ridden just as well off-road. It stood out like a poor cousin parked alongside the bikes out in front of the Oakland clubhouse. The more I interacted with the West Coast officers and charters such as Oakland and Richmond, the more I found my legs as a leader. There were a lot of examples around of how I wanted to lead, and some of how I didn't. I started to have a clear vision for Waco. I knew what type of guys I wanted to run with, and I knew I had what it took to ride at the front of the pack. I was also cutting my teeth in business. All the way back to when I was an independent, I had hung out at a motorcycle shop in Ventura owned by a crusty old mechanic named Lee Stanley. A stoop-shouldered hard case, he had eyebrows like foxtails and hands stained dark from decades of grease that even lava soap couldn't remove. I had met Lee because I had latched onto an old Indian and taken it to a shop in L.A. when I had a problem I couldn't figure out. They had only made it worse. Lee was an expert with Indian motorcycles, though he could fix any old scooter. He helped me out and got the bike running perfectly. We had become friends, even though he disliked outlaw bikers. As I hung out, he'd say, "Do you want to try to put these flywheels back together with me? Or, do me a favor and mic those bearings if you're just going to sit there." With his help, I learned how to strip down a bike and put it back together much tighter. Lee let me work on my bikes in his shop, and after I learned everything I could, I moved on. I eventually started building a parts business in Oxnard. I'd buy old Harley parts at swap meets, refurbish them, and then sell them through direct mail ads in magazines and newspapers. The business was called Recycled Harley-Davidson, and it provided a healthy supplement to my DoD paycheck, and was a good way to indulge my love of old bikes. Things were working out for me, but not for everyone. 4 months into his second stint as president, John was done. He'd been diagnosed with cancer, but kept it quiet. He couldn't handle the duties of a club officer, and probably wasn't going to be able to be an active member much longer. He had never looked young, but now he looked like he had aged 10 years in a matter of months. I knew what was coming when he asked me to take a walk. "Georgie, I'm done. I can't do it no more." "Jesus, John, it's that bad?" "Ah, it's not the cancer. I'm too old for this shit anyway. The club's changing, and it needs guys like you to lead it. I'm a dinosaur." "Not to me, you're not." He patted my shoulder. "Next meeting, I'm telling them I want you to take over. It's a good time for it. Those guys up north like you." "Okay, John, but I'm always going to think of you as the leader." That was a white lie. I already knew I had taken over as the leader of the charter. The smaller group that we become made the vote easy. I switched my vice president patch for one that said president. Everything was changing fast. I felt like I had just made member, and suddenly I was president. Mariah was becoming a strong-willed 10-year-old, a short, cute, smart, tough, spunky kid who was reading 2 levels above her grade. I could clearly remember her bumping around the living room, barely big enough to walk 3 steps in a row. Georgie had begun to look like me, and was growing into a rambunctious little boy who rarely smiled, but had a sweetness about him that just made you want to protect him from the world. Cheryl was always distant, and more so any time I took off for a few days, but the president patch on the front of my vest caught her attention. She saw how members deferred to me and heard my side of a lot of phone calls. I could tell that she looked at my power as hers. The gears were turning as she tried to figure how she could use it to her advantage. For all that, the biggest change was yet to come. I knew how the DoD felt about outlaw bikers. It was a prim and proper work environment. They tolerated my long hair, beard, and tattoos, and regularly kidded me about being an outlaw. But I didn't talk about the life, and I had no problems at work. Then the friend I rode to work with was hanging out with a few of our co-workers one day and let slip that I was a Hell's Angel. He apologized to me before I even got called into the office, but it didn't matter. It would have been just a matter of time before they found out anyway. The foreman sat behind a big tanker desk that took up most of his office. He liked me, and I think he hoped what he'd heard wasn't true. What's going on, George? I understand you're a member of the Hells Angels? That's right, I am. We kind of always thought that was a joke, that you were an outlaw. We didn't think it was real. It's real. I'm a member and an officer. He shook his head. It simply didn't register that someone he got along with, someone friendly and social, was this terrible thing he had read about in the papers or seen reports about on the 6 o'clock news. You know you're going to get pushed out of here, right? You need to make a choice, George. The DOD won't stand for it. I didn't have to think about it. I quit on the spot. There was no turning back. Now I was only what I was always meant to be. An outlaw. Nothing more. 7. Hells Angels are independent people, and it shows in how they choose to make a living. Some drive trucks, some build bikes, some hire themselves out as muscle, others start their own businesses. A fair number of angels turn to crime. But the most common jobs among members are just about anything having to do with motorcycles, especially Harleys. Without a DOD paycheck coming in every week, I needed to create income. The parts exchange business wasn't growing. I knew it was time for a change. So I moved my business to a shop in my garage, renaming it California Motor Works. In the early 80s, Southern California had few high-end motorcycle speed shops. I changed my focus to engines rather than parts because the profit margin was better and custom engines were easy to sell. I became one of the early high-performance motor builders, long before big builders such as S&S would become household names thanks to reality TV shows. I fabricated whatever I needed, experimenting constantly to get more power out of the engines. When I got it right, the motors were hot rod power plants, and I couldn't build them fast enough. Around the same time, another business opportunity popped up in Ventura. A friend named Scurvy George Aiden owned Ventura Tattoo. Scurvy George was a biker, but not affiliated. He was so short that at a stop he had to hold his bike up on his tiptoes. He was a funny guy who always rode with a handlebar bedroll, even though he never went farther than from one end of Ventura to the other. He had bulky black horn-rimmed glasses and a mane of black hair greased straight back. A real